"How hard can one job be?" she asked at 9:03 a.m., right before telling me I was easily replaceable. 3 months later, for people were doing my work, a $7.8 million client was ready to leave, and she was calling me from the parking lot. She thought I was one person doing one job badly because she only saw the title on my email signature. She did not see the systems, relationships, deadlines, and quiet decisions holding the whole operation together. By the time she did, replacing me had cost more than keeping me ever would have. Every story here is about someone who got underestimated and made them regret it. My name is Olivia Bennett, and for 8 years, I worked for a company called Northline Facilities Group. Northline managed commercial properties, office towers, medical campuses, research buildings, distribution centers. The kinds of places most people walk into without thinking about what keeps them working. Lights came on. Elevators ran. Security badges opened doors. Heating worked in January. Cooling worked in July. Water did not pour through ceilings. And when something broke at 2 a.m., someone had to know who to call before a small failure became a six-figure disaster. That someone was usually me. My official title was Regional Operations Manager. It sounded broad because it was broad. I managed service contracts across 27 commercial properties in 3 states. I supervised vendors. I coordinated emergency repairs. I reviewed operating budgets. I handled client escalations. I tracked compliance inspections. I approved invoices. I built annual maintenance plans. I trained site coordinators. And when senior leadership promised a client something that had not been fully thought through, I was the person who figured out how to make the promise real without creating a larger problem later. Northline's biggest clients did not know every executive in the company. They knew me. They knew I answered calls. They knew I did not hide bad news. They knew that when I said I would send an update at 3 p.m., they would receive it at 2:55. That kind of trust is not flashy. It does not fit neatly into a quarterly dashboard, but it keeps contracts alive. One of our largest accounts was a company called Helix Medical Properties. Helix owned 12 outpatient medical centers across Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio. Northline managed building operations for all 12. The annual contract was worth $7.8 million. If we handled the work well, Helix planned to add 6 new facilities over the next 2 years. That would have pushed the account past $14 million. I had managed Helix for 5 years. I knew their facilities director, Martin Evers. I knew their chief financial officer, Diane Porter. I knew their building standards. I knew their emergency protocol. And I knew that medical properties did not tolerate delays the way ordinary office buildings did. If an air conditioning system failed in a retail store, customers got uncomfortable. If a cooling system failed near a medical imaging suite, appointments could be canceled, equipment could be damaged, and patients could be sent elsewhere. The difference was not subtle, but it was invisible to people who only reviewed maintenance costs from a conference room. Then Northline hired Vanessa Reed. Vanessa became vice president of operations after a larger property services company acquired a minority stake in Northline. She was 39, ambitious, highly polished, and always carried a tablet under one arm, even when nobody had asked her to present anything. She loved charts. She loved scorecards. She loved turning complicated work into colored boxes. Green meant efficient. Yellow meant attention needed. Red meant unacceptable. Vanessa believed every problem could be diagnosed by looking at a dashboard long enough. And if the dashboard did not show the problem, she assumed the problem did not exist. Her favorite phrase was, "We need to stop rewarding complexity." She said it in leadership meetings. She said it during budget reviews. She said it whenever someone explained that a client had unique needs. We need to stop rewarding complexity. What she meant was that she wanted every property managed the same way, even when the properties were not remotely the same. A suburban office park was not a surgical center. A distribution warehouse was not a research laboratory. A corporate headquarters was not a building with MRI equipment, emergency generators, and temperature-sensitive medication storage. But Vanessa did not see those distinctions as operational realities. She saw them as excuses. Her first 6 months at Northline were full of changes. She centralized vendor approvals. She reduced site-level spending authority. She required every manager to use the same monthly reporting template. She moved emergency vendor relationships into a procurement database. And she announced that the company had too many single points of failure. That part was not wrong. I had said the same thing myself. No operation should depend entirely on one person. But I had spent years asking for cross-training support. I had asked for an assistant regional manager. I had asked for a dedicated contract analyst. I had asked for better access to the maintenance history database so my site coordinators could learn how I made decisions. Each request had been delayed. Budget restrictions. Hiring freeze. Competing priorities. Then Vanessa arrived and decided the problem was not that I lacked support. The problem, according to her, was that I had consolidated too much authority. She never asked why. She never asked how many responsibilities had been added to my role without an additional hire. She never asked how many projects I had taken over after other managers left. She just saw one person handling too much work and decided the work must be simpler than it looked. The confrontation happened on a Tuesday morning in March. Vanessa had called me into a meeting titled Operating Model Review. That phrase alone told me it would not be pleasant. She was there. The HR director was there. And my direct manager, a man named Craig, was there as well. Craig had worked at Northline for 14 years. He used to be a decent manager. But once Vanessa was hired, he started agreeing with her before she finished speaking. Vanessa opened a presentation on her tablet. The first slide showed my responsibilities broken into 4 columns. Vendor management, client communications, budget oversight, compliance and reporting. She pointed to the screen. Olivia, this is unsustainable. I said, I agree. I have requested support for 2 years. She smiled. Not kindly. The kind of smile someone gives when they believe they have already won. We are not adding headcount, she said. We are redesigning the work. I asked what that meant. She said the company would be splitting my responsibilities among 4 newly structured roles. A vendor manager, a client services lead, a regional financial analyst, and a compliance coordinator. I asked who would own the full Helix relationship. Vanessa said responsibility would be shared. I asked who would make the final call during an emergency. She said each person would operate within their area of expertise. I asked again, who makes the final call? She looked irritated. Then she said, Olivia, you're easily replaceable. It should not take one person to do the work of an operating model. The room went quiet. Craig looked down. The HR director started writing something in her notebook. Vanessa kept looking at me. She expected anger. She expected pleading. She expected me to say she was wrong. Instead, I said, then I hope the model is ready. That was the moment she decided to eliminate my role. Not because I had failed. Not because the company was struggling. Because I had spent too long quietly holding together work. She wanted to divide into categories she could understand. My final day was set for 2 weeks later. And Vanessa made one decision that would cost her far more than my salary. She announced that the 4 new people would start immediately, but she refused to give me authority to train them properly. Vanessa believed my job could be divided into 4 clean categories. What she did not understand was that Helix had one hidden obligation in its contract, a 90-minute emergency response requirement that did not belong to vendors, finance, client services, or compliance alone. It belonged to whoever understood how all 4 decisions connected. And in late June, that obligation was going to become very real. The first person assigned to replace part of me was Nolan Pierce. Nolan became the vendor relationship manager. He had worked in procurement for 3 years. He was organized. He was good with spreadsheets. He could compare bid amounts faster than almost anyone in the company. But he had never handled a true emergency. He had never stood outside a mechanical room at midnight while a contractor tried to explain why a backup pump would not start. He had never had to decide whether a vendor was expensive or simply the only person who could keep a client's building operational before morning. His instinct was to get 3 quotes. That is usually a good instinct. It is not useful when water is moving through a ceiling at 1:15 a.m. The second person was Jenna Wolf. Jenna became the client services lead. She had come from hospitality management. She was personable, polished, and excellent at making people feel heard. Vanessa loved that about her. Jenna could write a beautiful email. She could lead a calm client call. She could explain that Northline was actively coordinating a resolution. But she had never reviewed a building automation system. She did not know the difference between a boiler failure and a chilled water failure. She did not know which client updates required legal review and which ones needed a technician on site before anyone pressed send. The third person was Victor Lane. Victor became the regional financial analyst. Victor had a finance degree, a sharp eye for invoices, and a habit of saying, "The numbers need to tell the story." He was right. But he thought the numbers were the whole story. He had never had to explain to a client why approving an emergency repair at 2 a.m. was cheaper than delaying it until business hours. He saw cost overruns. I saw the price of downtime. The fourth person was Tasha Bell. Tasha became the compliance coordinator. She was careful, intelligent, and thorough. She knew inspection schedules. She knew documentation. She knew deadlines. But she had never worked directly with a client during an operational incident. She saw regulations as a checklist. I saw them as something that became urgent when people were already under pressure. None of them were bad employees. That is important. Vanessa did not replace me with incompetent people. She replaced one integrated role with 4 people who had separate skills and no shared system for making decisions. The first week was almost quiet. That gave Vanessa confidence. She walked around the office telling people the restructure was already working. She said my team had been overdependent on informal judgment. She said the new model was creating clearer ownership. She said it during a leadership meeting while I was still in the building, finishing my transition paperwork. Then she sent me a list of tasks to complete before my final day. The list was 11 pages long. 11 pages. Vendor contacts. Client escalation histories. Current budgets. Compliance calendars. Property-specific risk notes. Open maintenance projects. Contract exceptions. After-hours contacts. System access requests. And special procedures for Helix. I read the list once. Then I wrote back. I can provide an organized transition of the materials within my remaining time. Please identify priorities and designate the decision-maker for each work stream. Vanessa replied within 7 minutes. Everything is a priority. That answer told me she had not learned anything. If everything is a priority, nothing is. So I created 4 separate transition binders. One for each incoming role. I gave Nolan vendor histories, approved emergency contacts, and contract terms. I gave Jenna client communication records, meeting notes, and current concerns. I gave Victor budgets, invoices, and capital planning forecasts. I gave Tasha compliance calendars, inspection reports, and reporting procedures. Then I created one final document. It was called Cross-Functional Emergency Decision Sequence. It was not dramatic. It was not hidden. It was a 6-page guide explaining what had to happen when a serious incident occurred. Who checked the operational problem? Who approved spending? Who notified the client? Who documented the event? Who confirmed compliance requirements? And who made the final call if those decisions conflicted? At the top, I wrote one sentence. Emergency decisions must be coordinated by a single designated incident lead. I sent the document to Vanessa, Craig, the 4 new role holders, and HR. Vanessa responded with one line. Thank you. This will be helpful as we continue to standardize. She did not assign an incident lead. She did not schedule a training session. She did not ask questions. She filed it away. That was her first visible mistake. She had been given the exact map of where her new operating model would fail. And because the warning was not written in red letters, she treated it like routine paperwork. My final day arrived on a Friday. At 4:40 p.m., I handed over my laptop. At 4:47 p.m., I gave Craig my building badge. At 4:53 p.m., Jenna stopped by my office. She looked uneasy. She said she had been trying to understand the Helix account. I told her she had the materials. She said, there is a lot here. I said, there is. Then she asked, who do I call if something happens after hours? I gave her the emergency number. She asked, but who decides what to do? I looked at her for a second. Then I said, "That is a question you should ask Vanessa before you need the answer." She nodded. I could tell she had not asked. At 5:02 p.m., I walked out of Northline. No speech. No goodbye meeting. No thank you from Vanessa. Just a short email sent to the company. Olivia Bennett has concluded her employment with Northline Facilities Group. We appreciate her contributions and are pleased to announce a strengthened operating model for regional property management. Strengthened operating model. That was what she called splitting one role into 4. For the next 3 weeks, I focused on myself. I spent time with my daughter. I took a job search course I had kept putting off. I met with a recruiter who specialized in healthcare facilities. I considered opening my own operations consulting practice. Then I heard from former coworkers. Not because I went looking for information, because people who worked with me knew I cared about them, and they wanted to tell me what was happening. The new model was not saving time. It was creating meetings. Nolan had to ask Victor before approving a vendor outside the normal budget. Victor had to ask Tasha whether the expense involved a compliance requirement. Tasha had to ask Jenna whether the client needed to be notified. Jenna had to ask Vanessa who should speak on the client call. And Vanessa had to ask Craig whether the issue was important enough to escalate. 6 people. 1 decision. What had once taken me 10 minutes now took 2 days. At first, the delays were small. A repair quote approved 1 day late. A client update sent 3 hours late. A preventive maintenance request sitting in the wrong queue for a week. None of it was dramatic. But operations rarely collapse in one moment. They weaken quietly. A late answer becomes a missed expectation. A missed expectation becomes a complaint. A complaint becomes a client asking whether someone is actually in charge. By the 2nd month, Helix had noticed. Martin Evers, the facilities director, emailed Jenna asking who owned the account. Jenna answered that Northline now had a dedicated multidisciplinary support team. Martin replied, "That was not my question." Jenna forwarded it to Vanessa. Vanessa told her to reassure him that the new structure provided more specialized expertise. Jenna sent the message. Martin did not respond. That should have worried them. It did not. Vanessa saw silence as acceptance. I knew silence from Martin meant he was documenting. Then came the first real incident. A fire suppression inspection at Helix's Bloomington Surgical Center found a pressure irregularity in a backup water line. It was not an emergency yet, but it required fast action. The property could remain open only if the issue was corrected or an approved fire watch plan was in place. Tasha flagged the compliance requirement. Nolan contacted vendors. Victor questioned the emergency rate invoice. Jenna drafted a client update. And nobody made a decision. The vendor could arrive that evening. But the cost was $14,600. Victor said it exceeded the unplanned repair threshold. Nolan said the preferred vendor was the only one who could arrive before midnight. Tasha said the inspection report required action within 24 hours. Jenna asked whether Helix had approved the spend. Vanessa said she needed more information. By the time she received it, 4 hours had passed. The vendor arrived at 11:30 p.m. The issue was fixed by 2 a.m. Helix did not close. But Martin sent Vanessa a formal letter the next morning. It said Northline's response had been unnecessarily delayed by unclear internal accountability. That was the first satisfying turn. Vanessa had spent months saying I created dependency by being the person who made decisions. Now the client had put the opposite truth in writing. Northline's problem was not too much accountability. It was none at all. If you have ever watched a company replace experience with a committee and call it progress, subscribe, because this was where the 4-person solution started costing more than one capable professional ever did. Vanessa called an emergency leadership meeting that afternoon. She invited the 4 people doing my old job. She invited Craig. She invited HR. She invited the company president. Then she blamed communication. That was what people like Vanessa do. When a system fails, they blame the person who sent the wrong email, not the person who designed a process where no one can act without 5 approvals. She told Nolan he needed to be more proactive with vendors. She told Victor he needed to understand operational urgency. She told Jenna she needed to take more ownership of client expectations. She told Tasha she needed to escalate compliance issues earlier. Each criticism had a small piece of truth in it. That made it more effective. But none of it addressed the real issue. There was no incident lead. No one had final authority. No one owned the risk when the responsibilities crossed departments. After the meeting, Jenna asked Vanessa directly who had authority during a major Helix emergency. Vanessa said, "Use your judgment." Jenna asked, "Whose judgment?" Vanessa did not answer. That question followed them into June. June was always difficult for Helix. Summer heat strained older building systems. Construction projects accelerated. Equipment maintenance schedules became tighter. And their largest facility, the Lakeview Diagnostic Center, had one weakness I knew better than anyone. The facility's main cooling system had a backup arrangement that looked reliable on paper. It had 2 chillers, a primary unit, a backup unit, a standard maintenance contract, and an emergency vendor plan. But the backup chiller had an unusual electrical start sequence. If the primary unit failed during peak load, the backup could not simply be switched on. The load had to be reduced first. A generator test had to be delayed. The building automation system needed manual adjustment. And the imaging suite temperatures had to be monitored every 15 minutes. It was manageable. I had managed it twice before. But it required someone who understood operations, vendors, client communication, budget authority, and compliance at the same time. It required exactly the type of decision Vanessa had divided across 4 people. And on the hottest Tuesday of the year, at 11:46 a.m., the primary chiller failed. The outside temperature was 97 degrees. Inside Lakeview Diagnostic Center, the temperature in the main mechanical room started rising immediately. The building's alarm system did what it was supposed to do. It sent alerts. Nolan received the vendor notification. Tasha received the compliance warning. Victor received the projected emergency cost estimate. Jenna received the client escalation message. Vanessa received all 4. And for the first 20 minutes, nobody knew who was in charge. Nolan called the emergency HVAC vendor. The vendor said a technician could arrive in 90 minutes. That was within the Helix contract requirement. But only if Northline approved the emergency dispatch. Nolan requested approval. Victor saw the cost estimate. $22,000 for dispatch, labor, parts assessment, and potential temporary cooling equipment. He flagged it for executive approval. Tasha reviewed the facility requirements. The imaging suites could not exceed a certain temperature range for an extended period without affecting scheduled procedures. She asked Jenna whether Helix had been notified. Jenna drafted an email. Then she asked Vanessa whether the message should mention the potential impact on imaging operations. Vanessa said not to alarm the client until the team had more information. That was the second visible mistake. The contract required Northline to notify Helix within 90 minutes of any infrastructure event that could materially affect clinical operations. Not after Northline felt confident. Not after the executive team approved wording. Within 90 minutes. At 12:31 p.m., Martin Evers called Jenna directly. He had received an automated alert through the building system. He knew there was a cooling issue before Northline had called him. He asked whether the backup chiller was running. Jenna did not know. He asked whether imaging appointments would need to be rescheduled. She did not know. He asked who was leading the incident. She said Northline had a cross-functional team working on it. Martin said, "That is not an answer." Then he ended the call. At 12:42 p.m., the backup chiller failed to start. The reason was simple. The start sequence had not been adjusted for the peak load conditions. Nolan's vendor was still on the way. Victor had not approved the temporary cooling equipment. Tasha was trying to determine whether a fire safety issue existed if portable equipment was brought into the mechanical area. Jenna was trying to calm Martin down. Vanessa was trying to run a meeting. And the temperature near the imaging suites was still rising. At 12:53 p.m., Lakeview's radiology director stopped 2 scheduled scans. At 1:08 p.m., the center began rescheduling patient appointments. At 1:15 p.m., Martin sent Northline a written notice stating that the emergency response timeline had been missed. At 1:18 p.m., Vanessa called Craig. At 1:22 p.m., Craig called me. I was standing in line at a coffee shop. My phone showed his name. For a second, I considered letting it ring. Then I answered. Hi, Craig. He did not ask how I was. He did not apologize. He said, Olivia, we have a situation with Helix. I assumed you might. His voice was tight. The Lakeview cooling system is down. I am no longer employed by Northline. I know, but we need to understand the backup sequence. That should be in the transition materials. We found the document, but we need someone to walk us through it. I looked through the coffee shop window. The sky was clear. The day was hot. And somewhere, 4 people were trying to divide a problem that had never been divisible. I said, Craig, I cannot provide operational guidance without a consulting agreement, access to the relevant information, and clear authority. He said, this is urgent. I understand. Patients are being rescheduled. I understand that too. He lowered his voice. Vanessa is asking for your help. That was the closest anyone had come to an apology. I said, then Vanessa can have legal contact me. He said, can you at least tell us how to start the backup unit? I answered carefully. I cannot advise you on a live operational system without an agreement. That would not protect me, Northline, or Helix. He ended the call. 7 minutes later, I received an email from Northline Legal. Their first offer was $125 an hour for limited transition support. I read it once. Then I laughed. Not loudly. Not because the situation was funny. Because they had made the same mistake again. They wanted my knowledge without my authority. They wanted immediate availability without terms. They wanted to treat an emergency like a favor. I forwarded the offer to my attorney. Her name was Megan Ross. She reviewed it and said what I was already thinking. They want you to own the consequences without giving you control. So we sent a counterproposal. For $150 an hour. A 16-hour minimum paid in advance. A limited scope for Lakeview's emergency stabilization and Helix client recovery. Full access to operational records. Written authority to coordinate vendors and make recommendations. Direct communication with Helix's facilities director. And an indemnity clause for work performed according to Northline's written instructions. At 2:04 p.m., Vanessa called me herself. She was trying to sound composed. But I could hear the strain. Olivia, we need to put the company first. I said, I am putting the client first. That is why the agreement needs to be clear. You know what needs to happen? Yes. Then why are you delaying it? I took a breath. I am not delaying anything. Your company waited until the system was failing to ask for help. That is not my decision. She said, this is not personal. I said, no. It is operational. That is why you should have treated it that way from the beginning. She was quiet. Then she said, your terms are excessive. I said, your 4-person replacement model has already cost more than my annual salary. My terms are the cost of an emergency specialist. At 2:17 p.m., Northline accepted. The payment cleared at 2:31 p.m. At 2:38 p.m., I was on a call with the vendor, the Lakeview building engineer, Martin Evers, and Northline's internal team. The first thing I did was stop the conversation. Everyone was talking. Nolan was discussing vendor arrival times. Victor was asking about costs. Tasha was listing compliance issues. Jenna was drafting a client update. Vanessa was asking for a status report. I said, one person speaks at a time. The immediate goal is to protect the imaging suites and restore cooling. Everything else follows. Then I asked the questions. What was the current temperature? Which systems had been shut down? Had the generator test been paused? Was the electrical load reduced? Had temporary cooling been approved? Was the vendor technician on site yet? The answers came slowly. But once they came, the path was clear. The generator test had not been paused. The electrical load had not been reduced. The backup unit had been attempted under the wrong conditions. I instructed the team to pause the generator test, reduce non-critical load, and prepare the backup chiller for a controlled restart once the vendor confirmed the sequence. I did not issue commands outside my scope. I coordinated the people with authority. That was the difference. At 3:12 p.m., the vendor technician arrived. At 3:26 p.m., the restart sequence began. At 3:41 p.m., the backup chiller came online. At 3:48 p.m., temperatures began dropping. The immediate crisis was contained. But Helix was not relieved. Not yet. Martin asked to speak with me privately. Vanessa tried to remain on the call. Martin said, "No. I need to speak with Olivia." So we spoke. He asked why I had left Northline. I did not discuss internal personnel matters. I told him only that I was working as an independent consultant under a limited emergency agreement. Then he asked whether the new model had the capability to handle future incidents. That was the hardest question. I could have answered with emotion. I could have told him about the transition warning. I could have told him about the 4 departments, the delayed approvals, and Vanessa's belief that complexity was a weakness. Instead, I said, Northline needs to establish a single accountable incident lead, clarify emergency authority, and make sure their teams train together rather than separately. Without that, the same coordination risk could happen again. Martin was quiet. Then he said, "That is what I thought." At 5 p.m., Helix sent Northline a formal notice of breach. They did not terminate the contract that day, but they paused the expansion discussions. The additional 6-facility agreement was worth more than $6 million over 2 years. Vanessa had wanted to prove my role was too expensive. Now the company had lost the chance to grow its biggest account because it would not spend enough to protect the work it already had. Over the next month, I stayed on as a consultant. Not because I wanted my old job back. Because I wanted Helix protected while Northline fixed the structure it had broken. I designed the emergency command protocol. I ran joint training sessions. I helped each of the 4 new role holders understand where their work connected to the others. Nolan learned that the cheapest vendor was not always the least expensive decision. Jenna learned that clear client communication starts with operational facts. Victor learned that downtime has a cost even when it has not appeared on an invoice yet. Tasha learned that compliance is not a checklist you complete after the emergency ends. They were all capable. They just needed leadership that respected the whole job. Vanessa did not last long after that. The company president reviewed the Helix breach notice. He reviewed the lost expansion opportunity. He reviewed the emergency spending, the delayed approvals, and the consulting agreement they had signed with me. Then he asked a question no one could answer. Why did it take 4 people, an emergency vendor, and an outside consultant to replace one manager we already had? 3 weeks later, Vanessa was removed from the Helix account. A month after that, she resigned. The official announcement called it a transition to pursue new opportunities. But everyone knew what it meant. She had said I was easily replaceable. She was right about one thing. My old responsibilities could be divided. It just took 4 people, 2 new processes, a consultant, and a lost $6 million expansion to prove that dividing work is not the same as replacing understanding. The lesson is not that you should make yourself impossible to replace. That is not healthy for you or your team. Good leaders teach people what they know. They document processes. They build backups. They create systems that survive vacations, promotions, and unexpected departures. But companies have a responsibility too. If they want to replace one experienced person with several specialized roles, they need to design the connections between those roles. They need to define who owns the decision when the work overlaps. They need to fund training. They need to test the process before a client emergency tests it for them. And if you are leaving a job, protect yourself professionally. Document your work. Keep records of your responsibilities and achievements. Follow your confidentiality obligations. Do not take company information you are not entitled to have. But do not perform free work just because someone failed to create a real transition plan. If they call you after you leave, ask for a written agreement. Ask for a defined scope. Ask who has authority. Ask how you will be paid. Urgency does not remove boundaries. And being professional does not mean accepting blame for decisions you are not allowed to make. Being untouchable does not mean nobody can say you are replaceable. It means that when people dismiss your value, your work leaves behind evidence they cannot explain away. The next story starts at 9 a.m., when they locked me out of every system I had managed for 7 years and told the team my departure would have no operational impact. By noon, their entire order platform was frozen, 14,000 customer shipments were stuck, and the executive who disabled my access was asking IT whether they could quietly turn it back on. Subscribe, because when they locked me out, they forgot one thing. I was the only person who knew why the system kept running.